given some leniency or to be given some leeway, despite their previous record, in not only in Darfur and two areas and elsewhere, but also and committing crimes there against civilians, but also being used in previous to quell previous protest uprisings.
So I guess this would be a useful moment to explain to our listeners about the switch away from its traditional allegiance with Iran, Sudanese former allegiance to Iran, to its its new alignment with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, and as you mentioned, helping to prosecute this war in Yemen.
Yes, I think what we have seen really, and this came during the previous administration, was a very clear decision from the very top for Sudan to cut previously very strong military ties with Iran in favor of trying to re-establish links with Saudi Arabia at the very outset, and also then subsequently once the Gulf crisis had kicked off, also to improve their relations more broadly with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and its allies. And I think it was late 2014, we saw the Sudanese government moving to ban Iranian cultural centers, to close those Iranian cultural centers that had existed. And that was an indication of the direction of travel. Then we saw an improvement in the corresponding banking relationship between Saudi Arabia and Sudan. And we also saw, I guess, an improvement more broadly of ties, and Sudan beginning to send troops, being the main troop contributing country to the war in Yemen, which began in 2015. And that coalition was obviously led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but had been backed by a number of countries in the Horn of Africa as well, including Sudan. So therefore, the ascension of Burhan, I think, suggests really that there is perhaps a consolidation of power by this military faction, which is aligned to the Saudi Emirati, and therefore in the future perhaps a strengthening of Sudan's alliance with them. Of course, President Bashir was very adept, being at the center of this security apparatus, with everybody answerable to him. He was very adept at being able to manage both sides of the Gulf crisis, including continuing relations with Doha, who of course were the key sponsors of the Darfur peace agreement, and also was extremely important for him to do this from a financial perspective, as Sudan's economy continued to worsen following the separation from South Sudan in 2011. So I think in terms of the pragmatic approach that was taken, President Bashir was very much keen to maintain relations with both sides. This had become increasingly strenuous, I think, for Sudan, and the state of emergency that was imposed 7 or 8 weeks ago now by President Bashir, which ultimately was his last stand, I think was an attempt by President Bashir to reach out to the Saudi-led bloc, including Egypt, and say, look, I placed my trust in the military. I put the military in charge. I have removed the party, the Islamist party, the NCP, from power, and therefore I would like your support. But at the same time, his message was also going out to Doha that he has maintained some key allies around him, including at the time Ibn Auf, the defense minister and first vice president, who were Islamists, and that the Islamist regime is in fact continuing. So I think these mixed messages really led to a loss of support for President Bashir's regime, and now we. Now we can see a different dynamic which is taking place.
So one of the fascinating things in Ethiopia when Abiy was elected was the quick footwork by the UAE to get involved with the Eritrea Ethiopia Cold War and find a solution to it, quite possibly to free up some ports in the Red Sea to help again with the Yemen conflict. It obviously, the UAE's fingerprints are all over Sudanese strategic level politics as well. Has this really been? Is this something that people are just starting to notice now? How far back does this date?
No, I think these aren't new dynamics, particularly in Sudan. I think in Ethiopia, as you mentioned, they really were quite new and have been, I think, very different. I think the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE did play an important facilitating role in enabling Prime Minister Abiy to reach out to President Isaias and to begin those talks. But I think, and they also took a lot of credit for having done so subsequently once peace was established. But ultimately, the driver of that peace was between the two countries, between the two leaders. And yes, I think you're right to say that there in Ethiopia's case, there is a mutual interest, particularly from the increasing influence of the GCC states in the Horn of Africa at the military strategic level, both in terms of the Red Sea security and the trading routes within the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, and also from the Ethiopian perspective, it met mutually with their desire to increase their footprint, their economic footprint externally, and the need for Ethiopia to increase its economy, to have greater access to ports, which it is doing through developing relations with Eritrea, with Somalia, of course Somaliland, and we see the UAE in particular having a footprint when it comes to establishing military bases and also commercial ports in those countries. I think in Sudan, Sudan has long been, I guess, the bridge between the Arab world, the Gulf world, and sub-Saharan Africa, and so the relationships, I think, were much more established. President Bashir had for many decades looked to the Gulf region for patronage, for to build up his defense network, also for funding at times of economic crisis, and so I think there are differences really in terms of the nature of those developments in Ethiopia and in Sudan, but ultimately the picture really is one of two regions, the Horn of Africa and the Gulf, include Northeast Africa, I guess you could call it, across the Red Sea, which are becoming much more integrated to each other.
Now, there are obviously some clear economic drivers behind the protests in Sudan, but I presume there are no quick fixes to be found there.
Well, I think there are some individuals who are outlining including Ibrahim al-Badawi, a very respected economist, who are already outlining some short-term measures that can be taken to, I guess, improve the economic situation in the country. And I think that will be, very important for the country in terms of moving forward. The economic situation had been a trigger for these protests to increase. They weren't really the reason behind them, but I guess the importance of getting the economy running again will be vital to Sudan in the short term, and especially in terms of getting people back to work as well. At some stage, a lot of thousands and thousands of people are protesting, and we currently don't have the political environment to move forward. But I'm sure, I think there is really a need to improve the economic situation, to reduce inflation, to halt the devaluation of the currency, and also to take measures that can be taken, I think, in a fairly short-term period, such as increasing spending on the social sectors and on development, and reducing some of the spending, the extremely high budgetary spending that has been taking place on the military, security services, as well as on the subsidies between the regions. I think subsidy transfers between the regions accounts for almost 20% of the budget. So I think there are some quick wins that can be made on the economy short term, and that will be important to getting Sudan back on its feet, to building, I guess, some sense of investor confidence as well, and enabling Sudan to start on this trajectory, which I think it really had been on a path of sorts to try and open up the economy and improve the economy. But this is something that hopefully, I guess, given the political environment, aligns with it, that can be boosted and that can be taken forward much more quickly now.
Tell us a little bit about the Sudan Professionals Association, because there does appear to be some parallels with what's been happening in Algeria, in the sense that a wide cross section of society's been involved. A lot has been said about the influence of women. There has been a real focus on making it peaceful. They've reiterated again and again this, that they don't want any violence. They've pushed that. They've articulated that message incredibly effectively. Who really stands out for you in the Sudan Professionals Association? Who exactly are they? Because I'm sure a lot of people have just discovered them in the last few weeks.
I think we are all discovering them in the last few weeks. We may know some individuals personally, or from a professional standpoint within the Sudan's Professional Association, but ultimately they are, they're a body, a union body of professional groupings of teachers, of doctors who have been extremely prominent during the protests, of engineers, of lawyers, who have been working together to orchestrate the protest movement since the 19th of December, and who have been extremely critical in terms of mobilizing Sudanese people, young people in particular, into activism, onto the streets, to call for civilian-led administration in the country, which is their continued call now. And of course, they have been important in establishing the Forces for Declaration for Freedom and Change. And this group, I guess, is an alliance of some of the SPA, as well as some of the main political opposition groups, including the Sudan Call Alliance, the National Consensus Forces, a number of civil society organizations, And they have now, formed a council. They have named the I guess the spokespeople, the leaders of the